The small, two-bedroom apartment in the outskirts of the city wasn't much, but for Raj, his wife Priya, and their 2 children, it was home. They had built a life there over the past 15 years, filling it with modest furniture, family photos, and the kind of comfortable clutter that accumulates when a family grows together. But today, as Raj stood in the doorway looking at his family for what would be the last time in many years, none of that mattered. "I'm going to the store," he said, his voice hollow. "I'll be back soon." Priya nodded absently, busy helping their 10-year-old daughter with homework while their teenage son played video games in the corner. It was an ordinary Tuesday evening. None of them knew that this mundane moment would be their last together as a family. Raj walked out, closing the door behind him. In his pocket was a one-way bus ticket to a city hundreds of miles away. In his bank account, a zero balance, because earlier that day, he had withdrawn every penny from their joint account, leaving his family with nothing but the month's rent already paid and whatever groceries remained in the refrigerator. No note. No explanation. No goodbye. The next morning, Priya awoke to find Raj's side of the bed empty. This wasn't entirely unusual, he sometimes left early for his job at the construction site. But when she called his phone and got no answer, a faint worry began to gnaw at her. By afternoon, that worry had bloomed into full-blown panic. By evening, when she tried to buy medicine for their daughter's sudden fever and her card was declined, panic turned to horror. The bank teller's words still echoed in her ears, "I'm sorry, ma'am, but the account was emptied yesterday. There's nothing left." For the next week, Priya called Raj's phone until the service was disconnected. She filed a missing person report, but the police found evidence of the bus ticket purchase and told her that since he was an adult who had chosen to leave, there wasn't much they could do. Friends and neighbors were shocked. Raj had always seemed like a devoted family man, if somewhat quiet and reserved. No one had seen any signs that he was unhappy or planning to abandon his family. "I don't understand," Priya told her sister late one night, her voice breaking. "We weren't rich, but we were okay. The kids were doing well in school. We never even fought that much. Why would he do this to us?" The why haunted her through sleepless nights as she scrambled to keep their lives from falling apart. With no income and no savings, she had less than 3 weeks to figure out how to feed her children and keep a roof over their heads. Raj, meanwhile, had arrived in a distant city where no one knew him. He rented a small room above a convenience store with some of the money he'd taken and began looking for work. Sometimes, late at night, his finger would hover over Priya's number on his phone before he remembered he'd cancelled the service. In those moments, doubt would creep in. But then he would think about the gambling debts that had been piling up, debts his family knew nothing about, and the men who had started showing up at his workplace, making veiled threats. He told himself he was protecting his family by disappearing. The money he took would be quickly consumed by those debts anyway. Better to give his family a clean break than drag them down with him. Or so he rationalized as he fell asleep each night in his sparse room, the sounds of the unfamiliar city filtering through thin walls. Back home, Priya's sister took them in temporarily. The children had to change schools mid-year. Their son, once outgoing and confident, became withdrawn and angry. Their daughter cried herself to sleep asking when Dad was coming home. Priya worked 2 jobs, one at a grocery store during the day and cleaning offices at night, just to start rebuilding some semblance of financial stability. "I hate him," their son declared one evening, 6 months after Raj had vanished. "I hope we never see him again." Priya looked at her son, seeing the pain beneath his anger. "Your father made a terrible choice," she said carefully. "But hating him will only hurt you more." "How can you defend him?" the teenager demanded. "He left us with nothing." Priya had no answer. Because the truth was, beneath her determination to survive and provide for her children, a part of her hated Raj too. Years passed. The family moved several times, always to small apartments they could barely afford. The children grew. Their son graduated high school and found work instead of going to college, something he might have done if their financial situation hadn't been so precarious. Their daughter, once so carefree, developed an anxiety about money that made her count every penny and panic at the smallest unexpected expense. And Priya aged beyond her years, the stress and exhaustion of being both mother and father, of working multiple jobs and stretching every dollar, etching deep lines into her once smooth face. 7 years after his disappearance, they had rebuilt a life without Raj. It wasn't the life they had planned, but it was theirs, forged in hardship and resilience. Priya had eventually secured a stable job as an administrative assistant at a local hospital. Their son was now working full-time and contributing to the household. Their daughter was in high school, excelling despite the emotional scars she carried. That's when the letter arrived. No return address. Just Priya's name written in a handwriting she would recognize anywhere. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was a brief note and a check for $5,000, a pittance compared to what they had lost, both financially and emotionally, but more money than Raj had ever sent before. Because there had been other letters over the years, appearing randomly every 6 or 8 months, containing small sums of money and brief apologies. Priya had kept these from the children at first, but as they grew older, she felt they deserved to know. This letter was different, though. It contained an address and a phone number. And 4 words that made Priya's heart race: "I want to explain." That evening, she sat her children down at their small kitchen table. Her son, now working full-time at an auto repair shop, listened with arms crossed defensively across his chest. Her daughter, a high school junior with dreams of becoming a nurse, stared at the letter as if it might bite. "Your father wants to see us," Priya said simply. "He's living about 3 hours from here. He sent an address." "So what?" their son spat. "He thinks he can just walk back into our lives after all this time? After what he did to us?" Their daughter said nothing, but tears welled in her eyes. Priya took a deep breath. "I think we should go," she said. "Not for him. For us. I think we all have things we need to say to him. Questions that need answers." "I have nothing to say to him," their son insisted, but the slight crack in his voice betrayed him. "We don't have to decide right now," Priya said gently. "But I want you both to think about it." That night, none of them slept well. Each lay awake thinking about the man who had walked out of their lives and left them to struggle through poverty and hardship. Each wondered what he could possibly say to justify what he had done. And each, though they might not admit it even to themselves, wondered if somewhere deep inside, a part of them wanted to see him again, if only to make sense of the abandonment that had shaped so much of their lives. As dawn broke, Priya made her decision. They would go. But this visit wouldn't be about forgiveness or reconciliation. It would be about closure. About finally getting the answers they deserved. And perhaps, about giving Raj a lesson he would never forget, a lesson about the true cost of walking away from the people who loved him most. The old sedan's engine made a concerning rattling sound as Priya turned onto the highway. She'd been putting off repairs they couldn't afford, and now she worried the 3-hour drive might be too much for the aging vehicle. In the passenger seat, her daughter Mira scrolled through her phone, pretending to be absorbed in social media but secretly stealing glances at her mother's tense profile. In the back seat, her son Vikram stared out the window, his face a mask of practiced indifference that couldn't quite hide the storm of emotions beneath. "We can still turn around," Priya said quietly, giving her children one last chance to back out. "We don't owe him this visit. We've already come this far," Vikram muttered. "Might as well see what he has to say for himself." Mira said nothing, just clutched her phone tighter. At 17, she had the least concrete memories of her father, just fragments of a voice, the feeling of being swung high in the air, the smell of his aftershave. Everything else she knew about Raj came from photos and stories, some shared by her mother in rare unguarded moments, others pieced together from overheard conversations among relatives who didn't realize she was listening. The address Raj had provided led them to a modest neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. Small houses with tidy yards lined the quiet streets, nothing fancy, but stable. Respectable. The kind of neighborhood Priya had once dreamed of living in before their world collapsed. This one, she said, pulling up to a small blue house with white trim. A well-maintained garden bordered the short walkway to the front door. A bicycle leaned against the side of the house. "He has a real home," Vikram said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "While we bounced from apartment to apartment, never knowing if we'd make rent." Priya turned off the engine, the sudden silence heavy with unspoken thoughts. "Remember why we're here," she said, meeting each of her children's eyes in turn. "This isn't about forgiveness. It's about getting answers. About closing this chapter so we can move forward." They nodded, and together they walked up to the door. Priya's hand hesitated only briefly before pressing the doorbell. The man who opened the door was both familiar and a stranger. Raj's hair had thinned and grayed at the temples. Deep lines framed his eyes and mouth. He'd gained weight around the middle. But his eyes, those were exactly as Priya remembered them. They widened in disbelief as he took in the sight of his family standing on his doorstep. "You came," he said, his voice cracking. "I wasn't sure you would." "We came for answers," Priya replied coolly. "Nothing more." Raj nodded, stepping back to invite them inside. The living room was simple but comfortable, a worn couch, a coffee table with a few magazines, family photos on the walls. Priya froze when she spotted those photos. There, smiling from silver frames, were faces she didn't recognize. A woman about her age. 2 young boys. "You have another family," she stated flatly. Vikram made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a growl. "Unbelievable. You abandoned us to start over with someone else." "It's not," Raj began, then stopped, sighing heavily. "Please, sit down. I'll explain everything." They sat rigidly on the edge of the couch while Raj took the armchair across from them. An uncomfortable silence stretched between them until he finally spoke. "Those are my sister-in-law's children," he said, gesturing toward the photos. "My wife's sister. They stay with me sometimes." "Your wife?" Meera spoke for the first time, her voice small. Raj looked down at his hands. "Sunita. We've been married for 3 years now." Priya's face hardened. She wore no wedding ring, had never remarried, had barely dated in the years since Raj left. All her energy had gone into survival, into rebuilding a life for her children from the ashes he'd left behind. "Start at the beginning," she demanded. "Why did you leave?" "The truth, Raj. We deserve that much." Raj took a deep breath. "I was gambling," he admitted, the words seeming to physically pain him. "For years. Small bets at first, just with friends watching cricket matches. Then bigger stakes. Underground poker games. Online betting. I kept thinking I could win it all back, dig myself out of the hole." "How much did you lose?" Vikram asked. "Everything," Raj replied, his voice hollow. "And more. I borrowed money from people you don't borrow from. Dangerous people. They started threatening me. Then they started hinting they knew where we lived, mentioning you and the kids by name." Priya's hand flew to her mouth. "You never said anything. All those years together." "I was ashamed," Raj said simply. "And then I was scared. These weren't men who would take pity on a family. They wanted their money, and they didn't care how they got it. So you took what little we had and ran," Vikram said, disgust evident in his voice. "I thought I was protecting you," Raj insisted. I used most of the money to pay part of my debt, enough to convince them to leave my family out of it. The rest got me far away, so they'd follow me instead of staying in town, where you were. You could have gone to the police, Priya countered. I had committed crimes too, Raj said quietly. Bad checks, loans under false pretenses. I was looking at jail time if everything came to light. So instead, you left us to starve, Vikram spat. I never meant for that to happen, Raj said, anguish clear on his face. I thought you'd stay with your sister, that she'd help until you got back on your feet. I thought your parents would step in. My sister had her own family to support, Priya said. And my parents were barely surviving on their pension. We had nobody, Raj. Nobody but each other. Raj seemed to shrink in his chair. After I left, I worked construction jobs, moving from city to city whenever I felt the debt collectors might be getting close. I lived in rooms not fit for animals. Every extra rupee I could save, I sent to you. Those envelopes with a few hundred rupees? Priya laughed bitterly. That was nothing compared to what we needed. Do you know what it cost just to get Mira's asthma medicine after our insurance disappeared with you? Do you know how many meals I skipped so the children could eat? Mira reached for her mother's hand, squeezing it tightly. This was a side of their struggle she hadn't fully understood as a child. When did things change? Priya asked, gesturing around the modest but stable home. When did you get all this while we continued to struggle? 5 years ago, Raj said. I met Sunita. She was a widow with a good job at a bank. When she found out about my past, she didn't run. Instead, she helped me get professional help for the gambling. Helped me find steady work. Helped me start to make things right. And you married her, Vikram said flatly. 2 years later, yes, Raj acknowledged. She's at work now. She knows you're coming. She's the one who encouraged me to reach out, to try to make amends. Amends, Priya repeated, as if testing the word's weight. How exactly do you plan to make amends for 7 years of abandonment? Raj reached for a folder on the coffee table and opened it. Inside were bank statements and legal documents. I can't undo the past, he said quietly. But I can try to help secure your future. The documents Raj slid across the coffee table represented more money than Priya had seen in years. There were bank statements showing a savings account with nearly 200,000 rupees. Property papers for a small apartment in a decent neighborhood back in their hometown. Insurance policies with Vikram and Mira listed as beneficiaries. I've been saving everything I could, Raj explained, his voice low. Sunita helped me invest wisely. The apartment is in your name, Priya. The savings account too. The insurance will provide for the children if anything happens to me. Priya stared at the papers, her fingers hovering above them as if afraid they might vanish if she touched them. Beside her, Vikram's expression had shifted from outright hostility to confused suspicion. Why now? He demanded. It's been 7 years. Because now I finally have something substantial to offer, Raj replied. Sending small amounts that barely helped, it only made me feel better, not you. I wanted to wait until I could make a real difference. Do you think money fixes this? Mira asked quietly, finding her voice. At 17, she was old enough to articulate the hurt that had shaped her childhood. Do you know what it was like growing up as the girl whose father abandoned them? When school forms asked for father's name and occupation, would leave it blank. On Father's Day, I would pretend to be sick so I wouldn't have to go to school. Raja's face crumpled. I can't imagine. No, you can't, she interrupted, tears welling in her eyes. You weren't there when I had nightmares. When I needed help with homework. When I started high school. You have no idea who I am. I want to know, Raj said softly. If you'll let me. Vikram laughed harshly. You think we're just going to welcome you back? Become one big happy family again? No, Raj shook his head. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I want to try to be there for you now, in whatever way you'll allow. We don't need you anymore, Vikram declared, though the slight tremor in his voice suggested otherwise. We learned to live without you. Mom worked herself to exhaustion to give us everything we needed. I know, Raj nodded, looking at Priya with something like reverence. You did what I failed to do. You kept our family together. Priya had remained silent, studying the documents before her. Finally, she looked up. What does your new wife think about all this? About you giving away your savings, your property? Sunita understands, Raj said. She's known about you from the beginning. The apartment was her idea, actually. She said every family deserves security. A car door slammed outside, and Raj glanced toward the window. That's her now, he said, a note of nervousness entering his voice. Moments later, the front door opened, and a woman entered carrying grocery bags. She was about Priya's age, with kind eyes and a steady composure that suggested inner strength. She paused when she saw the group in the living room, then carefully set down her bags. You must be Priya, she said simply. And Vikram and Meera. I'm Sunita. The atmosphere in the room shifted, becoming even more charged. Here was the woman who had the life that should have been Priya's: stability, partnership, a home. I'll make some tea, Sunita said after a moment of awkward silence. You all have much to discuss. As she disappeared into the kitchen, Vikram turned back to Raj. So that's it? You give us money and property, and your conscience is clear? My conscience will never be clear, Raj admitted. But this isn't about me feeling better. It's about trying to give you what I should have provided all along. We don't want your charity, Vikram said firmly. It's not charity, Raj countered. It's your birthright. Money I should have been contributing all these years. Meera, who had been quiet, suddenly stood. I need some air, she said, and walked out onto the front porch. After a moment's hesitation, Raj followed her, leaving Priya and Vikram in the living room. Outside, Meera leaned against the railing, looking out at the quiet street. Raj stood a respectful distance away. I used to make up stories about where you were, Meera said without looking at him. I told myself you were a secret agent on an important mission. Or that you had amnesia and couldn't remember us. Or that you'd been kidnapped and were desperately trying to get back to us. Raj said nothing, just listened. Mom never said bad things about you, Meera continued. Even when she was angry, even when things were really hard. She just said you made a mistake, and that everyone makes mistakes. Your mother always saw the best in people, Raj said softly. Even when they didn't deserve it. I have your eyes, Meera said suddenly, turning to face him. That's what everyone always told me. You have your father's eyes. I used to hate that. I didn't want any part of you. The raw honesty of her words hit Raj like a physical blow. And now? He asked. Meera shrugged. I don't know. I've spent so long being angry at you. I'm not sure I know how to feel anything else. Inside, Priya and Vikram sat in uncomfortable silence until Sunita returned with a tray of tea. She set it down carefully and took a seat in the chair Raj had vacated. I know this is difficult, Sunita said, her voice gentle but direct. Raj has told me everything. About the gambling, the debts, leaving you. I don't excuse what he did. But I've watched him work tirelessly these past 5 years to try to make amends, to become someone worthy of having in your lives again. You didn't think it was strange, Priya asked, marrying a man who abandoned his first family? Sunita met her gaze steadily. I thought it was tragic. For all of you. My first husband died when I was 36. I grieved him, but at least I had closure. You weren't given even that. Vikram watched this exchange with narrowed eyes, trying to dislike this woman who had stepped into their family story, but finding it difficult in the face of her candor. Whatever you decide about the money, the property, Sunita continued, that's your choice. Raj wants to help secure your future, but he knows it doesn't erase the past. And what about his relationship with us? Vikram demanded. Does he expect to play happy families now? Weekend visits and holiday dinners? He expects nothing, Sunita replied. He hopes, yes. But he knows that trust, if it can be rebuilt at all, will take time. On the porch, Raj and Meera continued their tentative conversation, both acutely aware of the fragile opportunity this meeting represented. Inside, Priya studied the woman who had helped Raj become the responsible man he had failed to be for his first family. Did you know, Priya asked suddenly, that before he left, we were planning to buy a house? We had been saving for years. That money disappeared with him. Sunita nodded. He told me. That's why the apartment was so important to him. He said you always dreamed of having your own place, somewhere no landlord could threaten to evict you from. Priya's composure faltered for the first time. To have this stranger know such intimate details of her life, her dreams, it felt like another betrayal. Yet there was no malice in Sunita's manner, only compassion. I don't know if I can forgive him, Priya admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. No one is asking you to, Sunita replied gently. Least of all Raj. When Meera and Raj returned from the porch, the atmosphere in the living room had shifted. Not warmer, exactly, but less frigid. Vikram sat with arms still crossed defensively, but he was accepting the cup of tea Sunita offered. Priya's face remained unreadable as she carefully organized the documents Raj had given her into a neat stack. I think, Priya said as Raj took his seat again, that we need time to process all of this. The money, the apartment, it's a lot to take in. Of course, Raj nodded quickly. Take all the time you need. The property papers are already in your name. The bank account too. It's not conditional on anything. Why did you really want us to come here today? Vikram asked suddenly. The papers could have been mailed. The money transferred. Why did you want to see us face to face? Raj looked down at his hands. Because papers and money are just things. Important things, yes, but I wanted to see you. All of you. To apologize in person. To answer your questions. To see the people you've become. The people we became without you, Vikram emphasized. Yes, Raj acknowledged. The people you became despite my failure as a father. Sunita, sensing the tension building again, stood up. Perhaps I could show Meera the garden? I've been growing some herbs and flowers that might interest her. Meera glanced at her mother, who gave a small nod. The two women stepped outside, leaving Raj alone with Priya and Vikram. The moment the door closed, Vikram leaned forward. Tell us the real story, he demanded. The whole story. No more sanitized version. I'm not a child anymore, I can handle the truth. Raj looked to Priya, who nodded. He deserves to know. With a deep sigh, Raj began again, this time holding nothing back. He described the gambling addiction that had consumed him, the increasingly desperate measures he'd taken to feed it. The initial small wins that had hooked him, then the devastating losses that followed. The loans from legitimate banks, then from predatory lenders, and finally from the kind of men who didn't use contracts or courts to collect their debts. The night before I left, Raj said, his voice hollow, a man came to my workplace. He described our apartment in detail. He mentioned Meera's school schedule. He said how pretty she was, and how it would be a shame if something happened to her. He told me I had 48 hours to pay back 3 times what I owed, or they would start collecting interest from my family. Priya gasped, one hand flying to her mouth. I had two choices, Raj continued. Go to the police and risk jail for my own crimes while hoping they could protect you, or disappear with the debt collectors following me instead of staying near you. I chose to run. You still should have told me, Priya said, her voice breaking. We could have faced it together. Gone somewhere as a family. They would have found us, Raj insisted. These weren't men who give up easily. And I was too ashamed to admit what I'd done. How I'd risked everything we'd built. Vikram's face had paled during this explanation. Did they come after you? Raj nodded grimly. Twice. The first time, about a month after I left, they caught up with me in a different city. I had managed to pay back some of what I owed with the money I took, but it wasn't enough. They made their displeasure clear. He unconsciously touched a scar above his eyebrow. The second time was a year later. By then, I'd been moving constantly, working whatever jobs I could find, living in the cheapest rooms. They found me again. That time, they broke 3 ribs and my wrist. And then? Priya prompted. And then nothing, Raj said. I never saw them again. I kept moving for another 2 years, always looking over my shoulder. I think they eventually decided I wasn't worth the trouble. Or maybe they got arrested for something else. I don't know. Outside, Meera was helping Sunita gather some fresh mint from the small herb garden. The older woman worked silently for a few moments before speaking. When I first met your father, she said carefully, he was a broken man. Working as a night watchman at the apartment building where I lived. He wouldn't look anyone in the eye. Wouldn't accept even small kindnesses. It took months before he would even tell me his real name. Meera plucked a leaf of mint, crushing it between her fingers and inhaling the sharp, fresh scent. Why are you telling me this? Because I want you to know that the man sitting in that living room has fought hard to become someone better than the man who left you, Sunita replied. Not to excuse what he did, but to explain that people can change. Even people who have made terrible mistakes. Inside, the difficult conversation continued. Vikram had moved from shock to calculation as he processed Raj's story. So all these years, while we struggled, you were protecting us, he said, skepticism clear in his voice. That's convenient. I was protecting you from a danger I created, Raj corrected. There's no nobility in that. And once that danger passed, I should have found you immediately. Instead, I convinced myself you were better off without me. That coming back into your lives would only disrupt whatever stability you'd managed to build. That wasn't your decision to make, Priya said quietly. No, Raj agreed. It wasn't. Just another in a long list of selfish choices. A heavy silence fell over the room. Through the window, they could see Sunita showing Meera something in the garden, the girl's face animated in a way it hadn't been since they'd arrived. She looks like you, Raj told Priya softly. She has your smile. She rarely uses it anymore, Priya replied. She used to be such a happy child. The unspoken accusation hung in the air between them. What do you want from us, Raj? Priya finally asked. Really want? Not just what you're willing to settle for. Raj took a deep breath. I want to be part of your lives again. Not living together as before, I know that's impossible. But to know you. To be there when you need help. To see Meera graduate. To help Vikram if he ever wants to start his own business instead of working for others. How do you know I want my own business? Vikram asked, surprised. Your mother mentioned it in one of her letters, Raj said. Letters? Vikram turned to Priya. You wrote to him? Priya nodded slowly. After the first year, when I realized he wasn't coming back, I sent a letter to his parents' address. I didn't know where else to send it. I thought they might forward it. After that, whenever he sent money, I would write back to whatever return address was on the envelope. Just basic updates about you too. Your school, your health. I never knew if he actually read them. I read every word, Raj said quietly. I memorized them. Wait, Vikram interjected, looking betrayed. You've been in contact with him all these years? While letting me believe he was completely gone? Priya shook her head. Not in contact. I sent information into the void, never knowing if it reached him. I never received replies, just those occasional envelopes with money. No notes, no explanations. I didn't feel I had the right to write back, Raj admitted. To ask questions. To act like a father when I had abandoned that role. Outside, Meera was holding a small potted plant Sunita had given her, some kind of flowering herb. For the first time that day, she looked almost at ease. I thought this visit would bring closure, Priya said, watching her daughter through the window. That we would say what needed to be said, take the financial help you're offering, and leave with the past finally settled. But I'm realizing it's not that simple. No, Raj agreed. It never is. I need to think, Priya said, gathering the documents. We all do. This is too much for one day. As if on cue, Meera and Sunita returned from the garden. The girl was carefully cradling the potted plant, and something in her posture had softened. We should go, Priya announced, standing. It's a long drive back. Will I see you again? Raj asked, unable to keep the hope from his voice. Priya looked at her children, Vikram still guarded and conflicted, Meera thoughtful as she held her small gift from Sunita. That, she said, will depend on them. The drive home was heavy with silence. Each member of the family was lost in their own thoughts, processing the revelations of the day. Priya kept her eyes fixed on the road, occasionally glancing in the rearview mirror at her children. Vikram stared out the window, his jaw clenched tight. Meera sat with the small potted plant from Sunita's garden cradled carefully in her lap, her fingers gently touching its leaves. It wasn't until they were about halfway home that Vikram finally spoke. You should have told me about the letters, he said to his mother, his voice tight with controlled emotion. All these years, I thought he never even tried to know about us. He didn't write back, Vikram, Priya replied softly. I was just keeping a record. Sending updates into the void. I didn't want to get your hopes up when I had no idea if he even cared. But the money, Vikram pressed. He sent money. That meant something, didn't it? Priya sighed. At the time, it felt like guilt payments. Too little, too late. And never enough to really help us. I didn't want you and Meera to think that money could make up for abandonment. From the back seat, Meera spoke up. I think Mom did what she thought was best, she said, surprising both her mother and brother with her defense. And maybe Dad did what he thought was best too. Even if they were both wrong. Vikram turned to look at his sister. Since when are you on his side? I'm not on anyone's side, Meera replied, her voice steady. I'm just tired of being angry all the time. It takes so much energy. They lapsed back into silence for several miles before Priya spoke again. What do you two want to do? She asked. About Raj. About his offer to be part of our lives again. This has to be your decision too. I don't know, Meera admitted. Part of me wants to never see him again. But another part. I've spent so long wondering who he was, why he left. Now that I know, I almost feel like I need more answers, not fewer. He abandoned us, Vikram said flatly. End of story. Is it though? Meera challenged. He was trying to protect us from dangerous people. He made terrible choices, yes. But he's been trying to make amends. After 7 years. Vikram exclaimed. Where was he when you had to go to the hospital with asthma attacks? Where was he when Mom worked double shifts until she could barely stand? Where was he when I had to drop out of school to help pay bills? Priya flinched at the reminder of that painful time. Vikram had been just 16 when he'd insisted on quitting school to work full-time. She'd fought him on it, but in the end, they'd needed the money too desperately to refuse. I'm not saying we should forgive him, Meera said quietly. I'm just saying, maybe there's something to be gained from hearing him out. From understanding. The remainder of the journey passed in contemplative silence. By the time they arrived home to their small apartment, it was late evening. The envelope of documents Raj had given them sat on the kitchen table like a ticking bomb as they moved around each other in the familiar dance of their evening routine. As Priya prepared a simple dinner, she found her mind wandering back to earlier times. The small joys of their life before Raj left. The plans they'd made together. The dream of owning their own home someday. Now, according to those papers, she owned an apartment. The very thing they'd saved for all those years. We should look at the apartment, she said abruptly as they sat down to eat. The one Raj put in my name. We should at least see what it is. Vikram looked up, surprised. You're considering accepting it? I'm considering looking at it, Priya corrected. The property belongs to us now, legally. We should know what we own. And if we don't want it? Vikram challenged. If we don't want anything from him? Then we sell it, Priya replied simply. And use the money for Meera's college fund. Or for you to start that business you've been talking about. I don't want his money, Vikram insisted. Then think of it as our money, Priya said firmly. Money that should have been supporting us all these years. Money that's owed, not given. The next morning, Priya called the number on the property papers. The property manager was polite and efficient, arranging for them to view the apartment that weekend. As she hung up the phone, she noticed Meera carefully repotting the plants Sunita had given her into a larger container. What kind of plant is that? She asked, trying to sound casual. Tulsi, Meera replied. Holy basil. Sunita says it's good for respiratory problems. For my asthma. The thoughtfulness of the gift, specifically chosen for Meera's health issues, caught Priya off guard. She'd been prepared to dislike Sunita, to resent her, but the woman's kindness made that difficult. Did you like her? Priya found herself asking. Meera considered the question seriously. I think so, she finally said. She didn't try too hard, you know. Didn't pretend everything was okay when it wasn't. She just accepted that this was all complicated. Later that evening, as Priya was going through bills at the kitchen table, Vikram sat down across from her. I've been thinking, he said, his voice uncertain. About Dad's offer. About seeing him again. Priya set down her pen, giving her son her full attention. Vikram rarely called Raj Dad anymore. The fact that he had done so now told her how conflicted he truly was. And what have you decided? She asked carefully. I haven't, really, Vikram admitted. But there's something I need to know. Something only you can tell me. What is it? Before he left, Vikram said, his eyes intent on his mother's face, were you happy with him? Were we a good family? The question hit Priya like a physical blow. In the years since Raj's departure, she'd focused so completely on survival, on moving forward, that she'd rarely allowed herself to look back at what they'd had before. Yes, she said softly, the truth rising to her lips before she could consider whether it was wise to share it. We were happy. Not perfect, no family is. But your father was a good man before the gambling took hold. He loved you both very much. He was proud of you. Vikram absorbed this, his expression unreadable. So the man we met yesterday, is he the man you married? Or someone else entirely? I don't know, Priya admitted. 7 years is a long time. People change. Sometimes for the better, Meera interjected, having quietly entered the room during their conversation. Sunita said he's worked hard to become someone better than the man who left us. And we're just supposed to take her word for it? Vikram asked, though with less heat than before. No, Priya said firmly. We judge for ourselves. Carefully. Slowly. With our eyes wide open. 3 days later, they stood outside a modest apartment building in a respectable neighborhood. It wasn't luxury by any means, but it was clean, well-maintained, and in a safe area near good schools and public transportation, the kind of place Priya had dreamed of providing for her children. The property manager met them in the lobby, handing Priya a set of keys with a polite smile. It's all yours, ma'am. Fully paid for, including maintenance fees for the next 5 years. As they climbed the stairs to the second floor, Priya felt a strange mixture of emotions. Resentment that they had struggled for so long when this security could have been theirs. Gratitude that they might finally have a stable home. And beneath it all, a confused tangle of feelings toward the man who had both caused their hardship and was now trying to ease it. When she unlocked the door and stepped inside the empty apartment, Priya gasped. Sunlight streamed through large windows, illuminating clean walls and polished floors. It was larger than their current place, with 3 bedrooms instead of 2. The kitchen was small but modern, with new appliances. There was even a small balcony where Mira's plants could thrive. It's perfect, Mira whispered, already moving through the rooms, imagining possibilities. Vikram said nothing, but Priya saw him running his hand along a wall, testing its solidity, as if confirming this wasn't some elaborate trick. As they explored their potential new home, a decision began to crystallize in Priya's mind, a decision about more than just an apartment, but about the path forward for their family. That night, after they returned from viewing the apartment, Priya sat her children down at their small kitchen table. The decision she had reached wasn't just hers to make, it would affect all of them, reshape their family in ways they couldn't fully predict. I want us to move into the apartment, she said directly. Not because it's from Raj, but because it's what's best for us. We've struggled for so long, and this is a chance for stability. For Mira to have her own room while she studies for college entrance exams. For us to live in a safer neighborhood. Vikram opened his mouth as if to protest, but Priya held up her hand. Let me finish, she said gently. Moving into the apartment doesn't mean forgiving Raj or allowing him back into our lives unconditionally. Those are separate decisions that we can make in our own time. Each of us individually. Mira nodded slowly. That makes sense. As for the money, Priya continued, I've decided to accept it as well. Not for myself, but to create education funds for both of you. Vikram, this money could help you complete the education you sacrificed for us. Or start that repair shop you've been dreaming about. Vikram's expression remained conflicted. It feels like we're letting him buy his way back into our lives. No, Priya said firmly. We're accepting what was always rightfully ours. What he should have been providing all these years. And we're setting the terms of any relationship moving forward. She reached into her purse and pulled out a pad of paper. Which brings me to the next part of my decision. I'm going to write to Raj with our conditions. Mira leaned forward, curious. What conditions? That depends on what each of us needs, Priya explained. For me, I need honesty. Complete transparency about his recovery from gambling, his finances, his life now. I need to know this isn't just another situation where he'll disappear when things get difficult. She looked at her children. What about you two? What would you need from Raj to consider allowing him even a small place in your lives? The question hung in the air. Mira was the first to respond. Time, she said thoughtfully. Not rushing anything. Starting small, maybe phone calls or occasional visits, before any big family events. And I'd want him to really know me. Not just who he thinks I am or who I was as a child, but who I've become. Vikram remained silent, arms crossed defensively. When both his mother and sister looked at him expectantly, he finally spoke. "I don't know if I want him in my life at all," he said bluntly. "But if he's going to be around, I need him to acknowledge everything we went through because of him. Not just with words or money, but really understand what his choices cost us." Priya nodded, writing down their thoughts. "I think those are all fair requests." 3 days later, Priya mailed a letter to Raj. In it, she explained their decision to accept the apartment and the money, but laid out clear boundaries for any potential relationship moving forward. She was direct but not cruel, firm but not unyielding. She ended the letter by saying they would contact him when they were ready to take the next step, whatever that might be. The response came faster than any of them expected. Just 2 days later, a courier delivered an envelope containing a single-page letter and a set of documents. "He's agreed to everything," Priya said, scanning the letter. "He says he'll respect our pace and our boundaries. He's grateful for any chance to make amends, even if it takes years." "That's surprisingly reasonable," Vikram admitted reluctantly. "There's more," Priya continued, examining the additional papers. "He's transferred additional funds to a separate account for therapy, for any or all of us, if we want it. And he's included information about the gambling addiction recovery program he's been part of for the past 5 years. He's really serious about this, isn't he?" Meera observed. "It seems so," Priya agreed. 2 weeks later, they moved into the new apartment. The process of packing up their old place was bittersweet. That small, cramped apartment had been the backdrop to their struggle, but also to their resilience. They had become a tight-knit unit there, the three of them against the world. As they unpacked in their new home, each in their own bedroom for the first time in years, there was a sense of both possibility and uncertainty. The extra space felt like both a luxury and a strange separation after being so tightly bound together by necessity. A month passed. They settled into new routines. Priya's commute to the hospital was now shorter, giving her more time at home. Meera flourished with her own space to study, her grades improving as college applications loomed. Vikram remained the most resistant to change, but even he had begun exploring business courses at the local community college, tentatively allowing himself to dream of a future beyond his current job. Throughout this time, Raj maintained a respectful distance. No surprise visits, no pressure, just occasional text messages checking if they needed anything for the apartment. Each time, Priya responded politely but briefly. It was a delicate dance of acknowledgement without invitation. Then came Meera's 18th birthday. They had planned a small celebration at their new home, just the three of them, plus Priya's sister and her family. The evening before the party, Meera approached her mother as she prepared dinner. "I was thinking," she said hesitantly, "of inviting Dad to my birthday. Not for the whole thing. Maybe just to stop by briefly." Priya nearly dropped the knife she was using to chop vegetables. "Are you sure? You don't have to do that for his sake." "It's not for him," Meera clarified. "It's for me. I think I'm ready to try. Just a small step." Priya studied her daughter's face, seeing not the child who had cried herself to sleep asking for her father, but a young woman making a thoughtful choice. "If that's what you want, then yes. I'll support that. What about Vikram?" Meera asked, glancing toward her brother's closed bedroom door. "That's between them," Priya said firmly. "Your relationship with your father isn't dependent on your brother's choices, or mine." Later that evening, when Meera told Vikram about her decision, his reaction was predictably stormy. "After everything he did, you're just going to welcome him back?" he demanded. "It's just my birthday, Vikram. Not a lifetime invitation," Meera replied calmly. "And I'm not asking you to talk to him or even acknowledge him. I'm just asking you to respect my decision. He doesn't deserve to be part of our celebrations," Vikram insisted. "Not after missing 7 years of birthdays." "This isn't about what he deserves," Meera said, her voice steady. "It's about what I need to move forward. I'm not saying I forgive him. I'm saying I want to see if forgiveness is even possible." The siblings stared at each other across a divide that seemed suddenly wider than the few feet between them. Finally, Vikram sighed heavily. "Fine. Invite him. But don't expect me to play happy families." On the day of Mira's birthday, the apartment was filled with the scent of her favorite foods cooking and the sound of her aunt's family arriving with gifts and good wishes. Priya had outdone herself decorating the small balcony with fairy lights and potted flowers, creating a magical space for the celebration. At exactly the time they had agreed upon, there was a knock at the door. Conversation stuttered to a halt. Mira took a deep breath and went to answer it. Raj stood in the doorway, looking nervous but hopeful. He held a small, carefully wrapped package and a bouquet of flowers. "Happy birthday," he said simply. "Thank you," Mira replied, accepting the gifts. "Come in. Just for a little while." As Raj stepped into the apartment, the home he had provided but never been invited into until now, he caught sight of Vikram across the room. Their eyes met, and in that moment, Raj understood that while one door had opened slightly, another remained firmly closed. The lesson he'd hoped to teach his children about family, about loyalty, had instead been taught to him, at a cost he was only beginning to fully comprehend. Mira's birthday party marked a turning point, not a dramatic reconciliation, but rather the start of a slow, tentative rebuilding. Raj stayed for exactly 1 hour, as agreed. He sat quietly at the edge of the celebration, accepting the cold politeness of Priya's sister and her family, the cautious conversation of Mira, and the stony silence of Vikram. When he left, he thanked them simply for allowing him to be present. No dramatic speeches, no grand gestures, just gratitude for the small opening they had provided. In the months that followed, a fragile pattern emerged. Raj would text Mira occasionally, and sometimes she would respond. Once every few weeks, they would meet for coffee at a cafe halfway between their homes. These meetings were initially awkward, filled with careful small talk and long silences, but gradually, they found their way to more meaningful conversations. Vikram remained steadfast in his resistance. He acknowledged Raj's presence when absolutely necessary but offered nothing more. If Raj attempted conversation, Vikram's responses were clipped and cold. Yet he no longer objected to his sister's growing relationship with their father, seeming to accept that this was her choice to make. Priya maintained a careful distance. She managed the practical matters related to the apartment and the children's education funds with business-like efficiency, but kept her personal interactions with Raj to a minimum. Too much had been broken, too many years lost, for her to simply welcome him back into her heart. Then, almost a year after their first reunion, a crisis emerged that would test their fragile new dynamic. Vikram, who had finally enrolled in automotive engineering courses while continuing to work, was involved in a serious motorcycle accident. A car had run a red light, hitting him at high speed and sending him skidding across the intersection. When Priya received the call from the hospital, her world narrowed to a single point of terror. She called Mira immediately, and they rushed to the emergency room. Vikram had suffered a broken leg, 3 broken ribs, and a concussion. The doctors were concerned about internal bleeding and whisked him away for surgery almost immediately. As Priya and Mira sat in the waiting room, clasping hands and trying to stay strong for each other, Mira asked quietly, "Should I call Dad?" Priya hesitated only briefly before nodding. This was family business, and regardless of the past, Raj was family. When Raj arrived at the hospital less than an hour later, he didn't try to take charge or offer empty reassurances. He simply sat with them in that sterile waiting room, providing silent support as the hours ticked by. He brought them food they barely touched and coffee they drank mechanically. When Mira finally broke down crying from stress and exhaustion, he offered her his shoulder. 5 hours later, the surgeon emerged with news. The surgery had been successful. The internal bleeding had been stopped. Vikram would recover, though he faced a long rehabilitation. When Priya sagged with relief, it was Raj who steadied her, his hand on her arm providing an anchor she didn't realize she needed. The days that followed established a new routine. Vikram would be hospitalized for at least 2 weeks, followed by months of physical therapy. Priya took emergency leave from her job, but it was only partial pay, and the medical bills mounted quickly. Insurance covered much but not all of the expenses. Without being asked, Raj stepped forward. "Let me help," he said quietly to Priya. "No strings attached. He's my son." Under different circumstances, Priya might have refused. But facing the mountain of bills and the prospect of Vikram's long recovery, she accepted. Not just the financial assistance, but the practical support as well. Raj drove Meera to and from school so Priya could stay at the hospital. He brought home-cooked meals prepared by Sunita. He researched physical therapists and rehabilitation programs, presenting the information to Priya without pressure, simply as options to consider. The first time Vikram woke up properly after surgery, groggy and in pain, he was surprised to find Raj sitting beside his bed while Priya and Meera had gone to get food. "Why are you here?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Because you're my son," Raj replied simply. Vikram was too weak to maintain his usual wall of hostility. "You haven't been my father for a long time." "I know," Raj acknowledged. "But I'm trying to be here now." "It's too late," Vikram said, though the words lacked their usual venom. "Maybe," Raj agreed. "But I'm still going to try." As Vikram's recovery progressed, something unexpected began to happen. The shared crisis created a context where Raj's presence became normal, necessary even. Vikram couldn't manage the stairs to their second-floor apartment during his early recovery, so he temporarily moved into the spare room at Raj and Sunita's house, which was a single-level home with no stairs. This arrangement, born of practical necessity, forced a proximity that broke through some of the carefully maintained barriers. Trapped in a wheelchair and dependent on others for the most basic tasks, Vikram found his anger gradually giving way to a grudging acceptance of Raj's help. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a crack in the wall he had built. One evening, as Raj helped Vikram navigate from the bathroom back to his temporary bedroom, Vikram asked suddenly, "Why did you never fight for us? After the danger was past, why didn't you come back?" The question caught Raj off guard. They had maintained an unspoken agreement not to discuss the past during this time of recovery. "I convinced myself you were better off without me," Raj admitted. "That coming back would only disrupt whatever stability you'd found. But the truth is, I was a coward. I was afraid to face what I'd done, afraid you would reject me. So I told myself that staying away was selfless when really, it was the opposite." Vikram absorbed this, saying nothing more that night. But the next day, when Raj brought him lunch, he asked another question. And the day after that, another. Slowly, painfully, they began to talk about the lost years, the harm done, the consequences that couldn't be undone. 3 months after the accident, Vikram moved back to the apartment with Priya and Meera. His recovery was progressing well, though he still needed a cane to walk and would require several more months of physical therapy. The time at Raj's house had changed something fundamental in their relationship, not healing it completely, but removing some of the poison that had festered for so long. On a warm Sunday afternoon 6 months after the accident, Priya invited Raj and Sunita to dinner at their apartment. It was the first time such an invitation had been extended, and its significance wasn't lost on anyone. As they sat around the table that evening, Priya, Meera, Vikram, Raj, and Sunita, there was a sense of something new taking shape. Not a return to what was lost, but the careful construction of something different. "I've been thinking," Vikram said during a lull in the conversation, "about that repair shop. The one I've wanted to start." "What about it?" Priya asked. "I think I'm going to do it," Vikram said. Use some of the education fund to get the right certifications, and then look for a small space to rent. That's wonderful, Priya smiled, reaching over to squeeze his hand. I know a place that might work, Raj offered tentatively. A garage not far from here that's going up for rent next month. The owner is retiring. Vikram met his father's eyes across the table. I'd like to see it, he said. It wasn't forgiveness, not exactly. But it was an opening, an acceptance of help without the bitterness that had characterized their interactions for so long. As the evening ended and Raj and Sunita prepared to leave, Priya walked them to the door. For a moment, she and Raj stood facing each other, the weight of their shared history hanging between them. Thank you, she said quietly. For being there when Vikram needed you. For respecting our boundaries. For trying to make amends. I should have been there all along, Raj replied, regret evident in his voice. Yes, Priya agreed. You should have. That's the lesson in all of this, isn't it? That presence matters more than provision. That family isn't something you can abandon and reclaim at will. That trust, once broken, can only be rebuilt slowly, with consistent effort and complete honesty. A lesson I had to learn the hard way, Raj acknowledged. We all did, Priya said softly. As she closed the door behind them, Priya turned to find her children watching her from the living room. Her children, no longer the devastated 10-year-old and angry teenager Raj had left behind, but strong young adults who had survived abandonment and emerged resilient, capable of setting boundaries and, perhaps someday, of forgiveness. They had given Raj a lesson he would never forget, that family was not a right but a privilege, not a possession but a relationship that required nurturing and respect. And in teaching him that lesson, they had also learned something about themselves, about their capacity to endure, to adapt, and ultimately, to find a path forward that honored both their pain and their hope for healing. The future remained uncertain. There would be setbacks and difficult conversations ahead. The damage of 7 years couldn't be undone in one. But as Priya rejoined her children in their home, the home that had once represented Raj's attempt at amends but now was simply theirs, she felt, for the first time in many years, that they were all finally moving in the right direction.